But let's begin a fresh episode of Reboot India. And today we have with us Sunil Kataria, the CEO of SAARC at Godrej Consumer Products, joining in on the show right now. A lot of questions for Godrej Consumer, what the demand trends have been post the second wave, what sort of recovery they're expecting, whether it's rural which is leading the recovery, whether it's the urban markets, and what happens to the correction in palm oil prices from peak. How does that impact Godrej Consumer, and whether or not it's going to aid any benefits for them going forward. So let's analyze all of that. Sunil, hi, good morning. Great to have you on ET Now. Hope all things well and everyone's safe at Godrej Consumer.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope everyone is safe at your end too. Thank you for inviting me over.
Yes, all things well so far, touch wood. Sunil, just wanted to understand, what is it that you're making of the sea change that we've seen from when the pandemic hit us, the first wave, same time last year, to what we've seen in the second wave, and now, now that the second wave has subsided, are you seeing a big uptick in demand, or would you say it's still just very slow and steady and calibrated?
So I think things are panning out pretty fluidly. So the situations are fluid. So like I can tell you one thing, that which when wave one hit India, I think there was a feeling at that time, if you see, was of pretty much of shock and surprise, because it came in very, very suddenly. In a matter of few hours, the lockdown came upon us. And I think that time the challenge was really about getting supply chains going first. And obviously, the front line also was, kind of closed. But the big issue at that time was that everybody was caught a bit by supply chain disruptions. I think wave two has been, while it's been pretty stringent, especially in the month of May, I think this time the things were much more better planned, I think at both the government's levels as well as the company's preparedness level. So if you see this time, the supply chains were by and large running smoothly across most sectors, and especially FMCG, I can talk of in our own company. So I think that was one difference that you have to take into account. The second difference which I see is the consumer emotions have been pretty different in the two waves. And that is where maybe I'll talk a little about what it could pan out to. Last time it was a huge amount of anxiety because we didn't know what COVID is and how it's going to hit. It was fear, a lot of anxiety, which I think the wave two translated into fear, because we had actually come out of seemingly the wave one pretty strongly and pretty successfully as a nation, and this took all of us by surprise. And this came closer home and hit much more number of people. So the emotion became a little bit of fear, and that obviously is not very strong for the confidence of consumers. So I think these are the two big changes which we see. And I think one third change which has definitely happened is, last time it was completely top end of the metros and the top tier cities. This time it's by and large all tiers of the cities, and even rural have got touched. So I think these are three differences that we need to keep in mind in the waves. Now the way things are happening right now, while there was a very strong recovery in the second half of last year, almost a V-shaped recovery had started happening in especially essentials and staples and the FMCG. May has as a month is a disruption, but the good news is, and that is something which is pretty surprising, and at least I'm pleasantly surprised. We feel that the recovery which has happened in June is much more stronger than that we all were expecting, especially given that the rural had got impacted. So I think we are seeing a very strong June recovery. So what this is telling me, that by and large, in FMCG, the demand may not have got disrupted too much, and the demand end will hold, subject to a few factors. And those factors in my mind are a good monsoon, which has started off pretty well, because that holds a key to a lot of rural demand. B, I think the pace of vaccination, which I think is really galloped in the last 3 weeks, which again is a very positive sign. And I think the third is the various stimulus which the government had put in the budget, if they get implemented very well. So I think they hold the key. And obviously the unknown piece in all this is what happens to the third wave or the fourth wave. That I'm saying, those are things you have to watch out. You can't predict.
Quite interesting. I guess, there's also that realization, Sunil, that all of us are sort of it's dawning very slowly but gradually that this is something that you got to learn to live with. Yes, sure enough, you got to keep a close eye on your purchasing and how much you're spending, but the virus is not going anywhere too soon. What I wanted to understand, Sunil, was given that 35% of your overall revenues do come in from the rural end of India, where is it that you're seeing a bigger recovery? Is it urban or is it rural? And I ask purely because this time around in the second wave, rural India as well got impacted by the virus.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what, I mean, first of all, the last year was all about huge rural growth, because we had seen, the metros and the larger cities had got impacted with the lockdown pretty badly. So rural for us grew at 2 times urban last year. That's the kind of multiple which happened. Now, May obviously has impacted rural, but I can tell you in June, I'm seeing a pretty decent rural recovery which has started happening. Now, as I said, so this augurs pretty well. In my mind, while there is definite impact on rural, June is too early to call it out because this could be a little bit of a pipeline filling effect which could also happening. But I still sense that there may not have been a very major structural issue with rural because of a 30 to 40 day kind of a lockdown this time. And my own right now early assessment is that the rural demand uptick that we had seen the second half of the last year, by and large remains intact. And the monsoons obviously are looking good. The harvesting is looking good. And I obviously believe that the kind of stimulus that the government had put in the budget, especially in rural areas, I think they will only aid the momentum further.
Morning, Nikunj Dalmia also joining in. The big trend in the first wave was that there was multiple, stocking which everyone did. Distributors stocked, consumers stocked. Because we didn't know when lockdown was opening, everybody was buying mega packs and large packs, which is that instead of buying 2 soap bars, you were buying the entire pack of 6. Were these trends there also in the second wave?
No, not at all. This is another difference which clearly happened. See, as I said, the consumer emotion in the first wave was the anxiety and the unknown. Because you didn't know what COVID is. You didn't know how long it lasts. We had no idea what will happen to the lockdown tenure, etc. So it was, and plus the supply chain was disrupted. Remember, that was a big thing. So people just did, there was a panic run on stocking, as you're pointing out rightly. And the shops and shelves, in fact, ran out of stocks for 5 weeks. So that first April-May period was hand-to-mouth kind of supply chains which were running across. This time, the supply chains were running almost at 95 to 100% levels by and large. Secondly, the consumer emotion was no longer of panic of saying stock up. They actually were more worried about safety, and the fear was a bigger emotion. So I think given that consumers knew that supply chains are in order, there was enough stocking available in the shops, and the emotion which was playing out this time, it was more about, hey, let me take care of my health and safety first. There was no panic run on stocking by consumers on any of the essential and staples. So it was by and large the regular kind of purchases which happened.
Before you came on board, we had the management of TCS and they've said, we've lost 400 crores of business because of COVID. Earlier this week, Tata Motors gave a profit warning because they have a problem in the semiconductor and supply chain has got disrupted. But like you said, the 90-95% of supply chain was working. Can I safely assume that in the short to medium term, there is no problem on supply chain or dependence on palm oil and other important ingredients irrespective of what's happening on the COVID front?
No, not at all. In fact, I think from our end, I would say that the supply chains have been running very smoothly. In fact, I can tell you that some very clear learnings which we have built into our entire supply chain system. One is the biggest learning that we have taken is that, see one thing which is going to happen even in May, and I can tell you the learning which I'll come back to that. The lockdowns of the future would be localized. That is one thing which is very clear. And we have seen even in May, the lockdowns were staggered across states. Each state was taking its own calls of how to do lockdowns. So the future, even when the third wave happens or a fourth wave, God forbid, happens, the timing is, the way would be a staggered, localized lockdowns. So the learning which has happened from the last time for us is that we are operating at maximum production capacities. We are, if it means building up some inventory, so be it. But the second part is make sure that this inventory is distributed well across the country. So I think that's a very important piece to manage, that if we have 35 odd warehouses across the country, make sure stocks are well spread out, because if localized lockdown happens in one area, you can always supply it from the nearby area. So to your question, we have taken learnings from the past. We've had very smooth running of supply chains and we don't see any challenges going forward.
Is the spike in commodity prices manageable both for you and for your end customers, or now I can interchange the word manageable with challenge and nuisance?
Sorry, I didn't hear your last line. Manageable with?
No, manageable, is the uptick in commodity prices manageable, or it is now a challenge and a serious challenge?
So, okay, first of all, there are two parts to it. So, the commodity price inflation in this year is a decade high. I mean, that's one thing which is a given for everybody. It's a global phenomenon which has happened, and there are these cycles do happen, whether it's crude oil or whether it's palm oil, which we're seeing this time, and many other prices of other commodities. This is the global phenomenon which is right now panning out in this year. It's definitely a challenge right now. But having said that, I think this is one must learn to manage, and I can tell you what we are doing about it. We have not passed on, obviously, all the price increases to consumer, because for us, the first premium is very clearly on driving top line growth. And we are seeing a very good momentum overall in the last year's results also that you have seen, and some of the guidance that we have given even about our Q1 results, you would have read that. I think the momentum is holding us for us on the top line and demand. So I think that's a priority number one, that we need to keep on ensuring that we have strong volume-led top line growth. That's one. Hence, the key game here is to be, at the same time, we obviously have to take care of our margins. Now, even if gross margins are going to take some drops, it is important for us to make sure through a mix of cost efficiencies, through a mix of smart strategic price pack architecture plays, and through fixed overheads management, ensure that you are able to come up and do a good balancing act on your EBITDA margins. And I think these are three things which we would focus on, or we are focusing on, which is strategically smart pack price architecture play. You can also play pricing between your brands. You can play pricing between your SKUs, and you obviously manage your costs very tightly. You manage your overhead very tightly. You manage your working capital very smartly. And all this will ensure that you are able to hold on to your EBITDA margins, maybe closely. And I think that's the game, because we would not compromise on volume and top line growth. And we'll do a smart balancing act of strategic pricing and volume-led growth.
Sunil, what's the outlook when it comes to the international business as well? It seems like Indonesia is recovering quite slowly. What's the update on some of the other geographies?
So I think one is I'm in a silent period, so I can only comment so much. But I can tell you one challenge which we are seeing obviously is that Indonesia is right now becoming a hotspot for COVID. So that's an area which we have to watch out for. So I think that is something I can overall at a macro trend which can comment about you. I think our other geographies have been performing very well. And right now, given that we're in a silent period, I can only talk this much on macro, but yeah, they're in pretty strong performance. And when Indonesia right now is, the only concern is the COVID. It's a bit of a hotspot, like what India saw itself going through maybe in April, May. Right now, that's what Indonesia may be facing.
Okay, fair enough. Won't probe there. But, you spoke of the commodity prices, and then you've also got palm oil prices, which are down nearly 20% from the peak. How has that impacted your soaps business?
So I can tell you on palm oil prices, one perspective which you must keep in mind, that the palm oil prices, even they have come down little, as you said, somewhat from the peak. The peak itself was 50% higher than last year. I think that's one perspective to keep in mind. That the peak itself, as I said, it's a 10-year-old high. It's reached that levels, and then there's a bit of correction. So even let's say this correction happened, it's still at a pretty high level versus last year, and it is also right now moving erratically within a band right now. So we are not seen as if there's a very major sharp correction which versus last year which has happened. So I expect, and obviously these are very volatile, and there are many other factors which play out in palm oil. It's not only one, there are geographical issues which play out in terms of seasonality, even in other crops in the US. There's obviously, the kind of usage behind biodiesel in Indonesia and Malaysia, those things play out. And then obviously Indian government's own duties play out. So there are multiplicity of factors. So the point one, even though the correction, they're still on a much, much higher level than the last year base. Second, they are operating within a band right now. The third is, I expect there could be some correction which could happen, but it's very, very fluid situation right now. So the name of the game for us right now is, as I said, ensure that you do right balancing act of, what I call strategic pricing and demand-led growth. That's one thing. And secondly, manage your internal costs and efficiencies very well to ensure better, margins hold up.
Okay, so let's look at the pre-COVID FMCG scenario. A very ballpark number was that you add couple of percentage points to the nominal GDP growth and you get the industry average. Yeah. When will we go back to that scenario when last year's adjustment in a sense gets normalized?
Okay, so I think, this is like a great crystal gazing question. So, but one watch out I want to tell you on this question, because this can be anybody's guess. But there's one difference which is played out in 18 months from a normal FMCG thumb rule that you're talking of. It has been a thumb rule earlier. COVID is playing very differently for different categories within FMCG. So I think in this question, I would just add maybe one caveat. It is very difficult to put a thumb rule to the FMCG overall right now, because each category is having a different, tailwind or headwind playing out for us. Just to give an example, obviously all essentials, hygiene, health, immunity products saw very different kind of, jump in the first COVID wave. You guys here only sometime mentioned, that huge amount of stocking of staples happened the first half of last year. In the wave 2, and obviously discretionary products took a beating even in COVID last year. Now in wave 2, again, what's the trend which is happening is the stock up of staples is not happening. They are par for the course right now. But again, there has been an uptick in health and hygiene. While discretionary still continue to gradually recover, but the pace is slower. So I think the question really to ask is, are category-wise trends going to go back to pre-COVID levels rather than maybe a FMCG PAN number going back to pre-COVID number? That I think is a very difficult, honest question, honestly, the question to answer right now. Coming to category-wise trends, that I can, hence, having said this background, I can tell you category with what I see happening. Clearly, there's a huge recovery which happened in the second half of the last year across both essentials, and even the discretionary started coming back very strongly. The discretionary had not reached pre-COVID levels, but they started hovering around roughly around almost in January, February, March, roughly around, I would say 80% of pre-COVID levels had got reached. And if my hunch is, if April, May had not happened, we would have in discretionary also touched back to the pre-COVID levels, definitely in this quarter. Now, with this break of the wave 2, the health, hygiene, essentials categories, they continue to bounce back very strongly. So much so that April, May 40-day period is just a blip, is what I read. And the demand remains by and large intact. What may have become a little slower recovery would be, I think, the discretionary pieces. And the reason for that is discretionary was recovering very fast. But I guess the emotion which has changed a little bit is that people are now more concerned and scared of COVID post-wave 2. And the second realization is that this is a year. This is the year you have to learn to coexist with COVID. That the post-COVID may not happen this year. You have to navigate ahead of COVID. Having said that, hence, there will be still localized lockdowns. There will be still restrictions on going out. So people, the discretionary category recovery, I expect will be slower. And I think that's why these trends will happen.
I'm just going to flip from demand to supply. The mantra most of the corporates have followed is that go for 1 or 2 large mega suppliers, whether it is from China, whether it is from any other location. Now the world is saying, let's look outside China, China plus 1, reduce our dependence on 2 or 3 large suppliers. Do you see that happening in your case as well?
Our case, I mean, even before COVID, we've had a pretty, what we call a distributed supply chain across, not only I think in terms of our vendor base itself. So while for obviously there are certain categories, all of us end up sourcing a little bit from China. But we have also got sourcing which happens by and large from other parts of the world. Like, for example, we have discussed palm oil a lot. right today. No, palm doesn't come from China. I mean, the biggest supplier of palm is Malaysia and Indonesia. So similarly, for us, there's a lot of other supplies which happen from, some even happen from US, some even happen from Europe. So while China is an important piece, in our case, it's not that we are hugely dependent on China. And in any case, post the last year's event itself, we have also ensured that we have got very strong backups planned of our supply chain and vendors across categories where we see dependency would have been there only maybe on one or two geographies. So we have taken that action as well. But thankfully for us, it was always a reasonably well-balanced supplier base.
What about on the manufacturing side? There are companies which, when it comes to own manufacturing, they follow a model of contract manufacturing. It reduces costs, keeps your book asset light. Could there be a change in thinking there where companies, maybe your company would like to have more ownership of manufacturing units?
So in our case, it's a pretty well-balanced base already we have. We have a very distributed manufacturing, and that's something which I referred earlier also. So for example, we have our own units spread out across Northeast, where obviously there's some fiscal benefits there. We have them in northern part of the country, we have South and we have West. So we have always had a very distributed 4 different geographies kind of a manufacturing footprint. Plus obviously there's certain places that we have a contractor base or a third party base that you've got. So I think the future, so I clearly saw in the first wave that one lesson many of, let's say, people I know and many of the, people in the industry and friends in the industry who were referring to it also, is that there were companies which did not have a very distributed, well spread out manufacturing pipelines. And they took that learning out of us. In our case, as I tell you, we have a very pan-India kind of a distribution, so we did not have that much of challenges. But having said that, I think a future play which will happen is that as a lot of companies had invested behind manufacturing based on a lot of fiscal benefits which had happened in the past 15 to 20 years. I think as fiscal benefits windows are closing and you're coming out of those fiscal benefit zones, I think what will happen that the companies are already and would look at a manufacturing footprint which will be much more TDC based or total direct cost based, and hence you may see a much more spread out all India manufacturing base happening.
What happens to the customer in terms of preference? I remember when I started my career, companies which had the highest penetration, the levers of the world, they were always getting an advantage. That is changing because now we have a phone in our hand and we are used to ordering online. Is there going to be a large change in the distribution for an FMCG company because of COVID?
See, I'll tell you what is going to happen. See, there's definitely, first of all, the consumer behavior towards online is undergone a big change in the last 18 months because the e-commerce and online shopping was anyway increasing. But I would say the FMCG was still lagging behind online purchases. That behavior was still not fully developed. I think that adoption has definitely gone into a different trajectory in the last 18 months or so. So for example, I can tell you what our number. We have our e-commerce business, which used to contribute around 2% to our overall India sales. Now that's moved to around almost close to 5%. So that's a kind of shift which has happened maybe in a 20-month period or so, you can say. I think it's a mix of the kind of investments we have done behind this business, as well as the consumer behavior change. Coming to your question, the way the trend will pan out, I see that modern trade in India has been hovering around 10 to 11 to 12% of the FMCG salience. And that's where it is kind of stabilized over the last, 5 years or so, I would say 3 to 5 years. E-commerce is started taking shape in the last 2 to 3 years. Most companies, it's hovering around 4 to 5%. I expect this trend over the next 3 years to land up anywhere between 8 to 10%. So I think that's something which will happen. That's one piece. Modern trade has got impacted, definitely in the 2 waves. But I still believe modern trade is here to stay. They have very strong fundamentals. They will come back strongly, but modern trade will have to redefine itself into a omni-channel space. I think that's one big trend which will happen. And that's something which you're already seeing, that there is a merging of, these whole fulfillment, which is happening behind, demand now. So consumer, because the key issue is, as I talked recently also, that the consumer is now an omni-channel consumer, shopper. The consumer is shopping. The consumer is maybe knowing about a product somewhere, shopping in the other channel. And there's an omni-channel behavior in consumer's mind. And hence, I think even channels like modern trade will have to become more omni-channel in their entire DNA and structure. Coming to GT, I think GT has actually seen a resurgence in COVID. Kiranas really held the fort for this country in the first half of last year, especially the first quarter of last year, when even e-commerce was taking some time to get its act together. So I think the Kiranas would never disappear from this country or forget. Disappear, I think, is too strong a word. I think they will always remain the backbone of India. We are already seeing a very strong digitization of Kiranas, which has started happening to multiple initiatives, And I think the three trends of the future would be digitization of Kirana, creation of omni-channel, shopper behavior, and hence a fulfillment, mechanism which is going to take shape. And I think e-commerce online is definitely going to reach maybe 8 to 10% kind of numbers. So I think all these three trends will pan out.
No, just to wrap it up, while we are in a silent period, so I will not get into specific of numbers, but I just want to understand a big picture philosophy, because last couple of years, Godrej has acquired, and they've acquired emerging market businesses. That time the emerging market growth was very different, because emerging markets were enjoying a huge benefit because of commodity prices. Now that commodity prices are coming back, do you see at a broad level emerging market growth coming back? Because that's where the challenge has been for last couple of years.
See, again, when you do an investment of these natures, and when you do that kind of acquisition, you don't do it based on a few commodity cycles, because the answer to my mind, this question would be the broader philosophy. You do such investments and such acquisitions keeping two things in mind. A, do you see a strategic fit with your overall business portfolio? That's one. And that's in terms of both geography as well as the kind of categories you're getting into it. That are they really the ones? And the second, you see a huge potential, underlying demand potential, which is there in those markets. I think forget these cycles right now. I think, are these two intact? And if these two are intact, I think that's a philosophy we follow. And I think I don't see right now too much of a challenge on that. Because these cycles do come and go, And finally, to make these successful, for any company, they have to make sure that you have a very strong execution base. And there, I think one piece which is we have always followed differently, and which is good, is that we have always done these, smart local acquisitions where we don't go away from the core of the consumer understanding at the local level. And our execution is also very local centric. I think given that way of approaching and given these fundamental principles on which we have done these acquisitions, I think we should not look at cycles, and we should look at the long-term potential. And I believe that remains intact.
It's personally been a big eye-opener for me to understand so many interesting aspects of what is happening in the FMCG sector and how consumers are moving. So I hope to see much more of you going forward on the channel. Stay safe, and lovely connecting with you.
Thank you so much.